Welcome back to episode 2 of WNBA Retrospect, a historical WNBA scouting series. Today we'll discuss Margo Dydek, the number one WNBA's all-time block leader and the tallest player in league history at 7'2". But first, if you missed last week's episode, myself and Em discussed USC's Tina Thompson, an all-time great, and the league's first number 1 draft pick. That episode will be available in the description below. Lotte Women's basketball starts now.
Ogunbowale for the win.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Welcome. You are Lotte Women's Basketball. Thanks for making us your first listen today. My name is Hunter Cruse, and I'm your Saturday host covering prospect scouting and women's basketball at large. I'm joined by co-hosts Adler and Lincoln Shafer. Covers WNBA in the New York market with a focus on player development and analysis at thenexthoops.com. Lincoln is an indispensable part of our scouting team. You can find him on Twitter at Dovinia_. Like I said, the subject of our conversation today is Polish center Margo Dydek. So let's take you back to the 1998 WNBA Draft. Dydek, a 24-year-old 7'2" post, previously turned out an opportunity to declare for the inaugural 1997 WNBA Draft to rest her body after a grueling overseas season in Europe. Dydek was selected with the number 1 pick by the Utah Stars in the 1998 Draft, ahead of passing savant Tina Pinheiro. So first, for you, Em, why was she the number 1 pick, and why was it because she's 7'2"?
You really throw me an opportunity to go on a nice informative session for the audience here. No, I mean, look, it's one thing to be like tall and not be able to do anything with it. I mean, we've seen Taco fall at the Boston Celtic great, but it's another thing to be tall and to like actually have an effect. And we'll get into this a little later in the show, just in terms of what each of us sees that effect as having been. But we're talking about a player who is effective and is able to play on the court and through EuroLeague, obviously a high level of competition, especially for those days. We talked about last week, if you remember, we talked about why there were some matchups somewhat often for Tina Thompson, even Lisa Leslie before her at USC, where the level of competition wasn't what we see today, and you can't really judge it by the same standards as today's prospects. And Margo Dydek, you're in EuroLeague. It's not the same level of play as it is today, but it is still that version of professional players. Like you said, coming into this draft, it's not like she was just tall and couldn't do anything with it. Like I mentioned, this is functional height. She, in the couple years preceding this draft, she was putting up about 15 points a game in the EuroLeague playoffs, compounding that with about 9 rebounds and about 1.5 assists per game, which again, for someone who is pretty much just a defender in terms of the biggest strengths, being able to put up those numbers and being able to be that effective is a real accomplishment.
Yeah. Like, to have that kind of height, especially in an era before defensive 3 seconds, which we've talked about a little off camera, is that, like, before there were rules in place to keep people from just standing under the rim and blocking as many shots as they could. That's what she was really good at, and that's what the rules allowed her to do defensively. So that kind of defensive presence is, like, one of the big things that brought value to teams that she played for. To keep people like away from the rim is a really valuable skill to have. So when you have someone who's generously 8 inches taller than everyone else on the court, it's going to make a huge difference in the paint on both ends, but especially defensively for someone like Margo Dydek.
And I'd argue the most important part of that isn't just being able to keep defenses honest enough to stick defensively and be able to use that, but the fact that she was, for her WNBA career, she ended up a 79% free throw shooter, and I mean you can see this when you look at really any of her tape. It's a good jumper form, and I think there's a lot of things that we can get into, and probably will, about the different aspects of her game and how those translated to the WNBA back then, and I think more interestingly what the conversation would be right now with current rules. But I think for her time she was a super effective defender, as Lincoln, as you just said, and that's the rules thing. And you see this especially with men's basketball as well. basically in the 90s, you had a lot of great post defenders who were essentially immobilized by the mid 2000s, and by basically 2013, 2014, they couldn't hang. They would get absolutely played off the court. And I think that's the interesting thing. And when you watch some of Margo's tape in Utah, the franchise that would become San Antonio, the times they make the playoffs, you can see when it really comes down to it, when she has to go against teams that are able to operate, these aren't offenses that are capable of, they're capable, but they don't frequently exploit switches and force them and try to play players off the court. That's just not a thing back then. You're trying to think people did. But you can see when every time she has to defend a player who's basically able to operate in space, there is basically no chance for her. And that becomes a huge issue with Utah at different points in the playoffs. And, if, I know it's kind of far-fetched to have a center for the Utah franchise who is an excellent rim protector but can't do anything in space when it comes to the playoffs, and that presents a team-building question for their team. But, just bear with me. And it becomes an interesting thing, I think, in evaluating her game, both in, like I said, translating to today, but also asking ourselves, what is the value, not just to winning games, period, but to winning specific games in the playoffs that you're looking for with this kind of skill set. And I think this week and next week, we are going to have some very interesting and probably different answers to those questions.
Yeah, so sort of on that note, going back to what she did pre-draft, watching her film, 7'2", 7-foot wingspan. That's another thing. Somehow negative wingspan on that 7'2". Still the long
wingspan. It's so funny. It's still probably the longest wingspan in the W at that time, but still.
Yeah, but I think if I was scouting at the time, my biggest question would probably still be just how her body would withstand a long career, considering that she did play overseas as well, right? So that probably would have kept me a little bit hesitant at the time, just considering, she's 7'2". Another part of that was I don't think they realized she was 7'2" either. I think originally they thought she was 6'7". So I don't think I read that in an article from back in the day, and they thought she was 6'7", and they didn't realize she was 7'2". I don't think until she came over for pre-draft camp.
Yeah, in the media guides, in the media guides in Europe, I read that she was listed at 6'6" in when she played for Bourges in France. And just the absurdity of that is a little funny to me, because if you see her on the court at all, she's significantly taller than everyone else. And that's not what 6'6" looks like on a basketball court.
Imagine taking a transatlantic flight to go do some international scouting, and you see on your notes, oh, there's a 6'6" player here who averages a bunch of blocks and can shoot well from the line. I wonder what that looks like. And you look up, and it's just 7'2" Margo Dydek. And that's Hunter, it's funny you mentioned the durability question. I think for anyone with that kind of size, it becomes a question. The interesting thing to me, at least on that note, is when we think about outlier size, my general translation between men's basketball and women's basketball, NBA, WNBA, just sort of prototypical sizes, it's about, I think, usually 5 or 6 inches, give or take, in terms of the difference between W and NBA. So Margo Dydek at 7'2" is about the equivalent of an NBA center who's 7'7" or 7'8". For reference, that's the tallest, relative to Lee, that is the tallest American professional basketball player ever. And she fills out the frame for the most part. There's limits here. She's not going to look yoked, but she doesn't look like Manute Ball. She doesn't look like any of the Bulls or the Falls. It's really interesting how that happens there. But I think to me, the biggest question, and this is what I was getting at before, especially when we got to talking about the playoffs, is as someone who is so effective within the rules of being able to camp out in the paint, but someone who has had a struggle of an offensive process or finishing, to be honest, this bears out in her career, but you can see it in the EuroLeague tape we looked at. The finishing's bad. It's shockingly bad for someone that big. The you see it a couple times, and it pops up more as you watch the WNBA tape, but her hands are surprisingly weak in terms of rebounding, and she puts up pretty pedestrian offensive rebounding numbers in the WNBA across her career, which is interesting because in terms of sort of the value creation of rebounding, defensive rebounding is very valuable, but it's not extraordinarily valuable at an individual level. It's more, and it's a lot harder to suss out whether you're adding much rebounding to your team, because for the most part, an offensive rebound that you get is an offensive rebound that without you, your team probably wouldn't have had, whereas a defensive rebound that you get without you, your team probably would have had, and there's a smaller chance the other team would have turned it into an offensive board. So it's harder to suss out value there, but it is telling to me that she was an elite defensive rebounder and a pedestrian offensive rebounder. And I think that's what you get into in terms of the tape is like, the size is excellent in terms of being able to protect the paint. That's excellent as well, just in terms of being an imposing physical presence. But in terms of, relatively bad finishing, weaker hands, and one thing that really stood out to me was just, Hunter, you can talk about this more after the break, but with how foul prone she was, there are things that you can see in her game where it is surprising how much of her rim protection is not actually rim protection so much as it is rim deterrence.
Let me tell you about BetterHelp. Whether you're dealing with decisions around your career, relationships, or anything else, therapy helps you stay connected to what you really want while you navigate life, so you can move forward with confidence and excitement. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Let therapy be your map with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/lockedonnba. So to get back into it, Margo Dydek, our conversation today, the tallest center in WNBA history at 7'2", 7'2" wingspan. Before we talk about how her WNBA career transpired, what we did last week was we gave our scouting grade. If we were evaluating the player at the time, how would we grade them out on our 20/80 scale? And you can explain that a little bit more, but last week we had Tina Thompson at a 60 grade, which basically means we view that as like an all-star caliber player, just from what we saw on tape pre-WNBA draft.
To be specific. Yeah.
Yes. So for Margo, where do you guys fall with her game? I'll give it to you first, Lincoln.
For me, it's interesting because I think that she brings a lot of value in the paint defensively and brings a lot of value in some certain ways, but has obvious shortcomings. So in that mold, we have there's a lot of players that are like that, and I think that I'd lean somewhere between like around a 45 or a 50 for my grade. That's like clearly brings value to a WNBA team, but has obvious flaws that will keep her from becoming like an MVP level player. I'd go either a 45 or a 50, I think.
And for reference for listeners, a 45. So 45 is essentially an average level professional WNBA player. So that means a top end of the bench player. So on a good team, that's your number 6 or number 7 in the rotation. On a bad team, that's a starter. 50 is an above average rotation player. So that's an average starter. Yeah, for me, it's very interesting, as I was sort of alluding to. Like I said, in terms of the Euro tape, because we'll get to her W career in a second, in terms of the Euro tape, as I was saying, with the rim protection, one of the things that stands out is that she makes so many mistakes with her form. It looks like someone who, and I know this isn't true, which makes it a little more worrisome if you're an amateur scout then, it looks like she basically picked up a basketball maybe 2 or 3 years prior, the sort of like Joel Embiid 1 year in college thing, where like her hips aren't moving in the correct direction most of the time. She's relying a lot on her arms, and what that really means is she's committing a heck of a lot of fouls. And the question is essentially, how much can you improve that, given her extraordinary propensity for it, her really, really lacking ability to defend outside of the restricted area. But what is that worth in terms of the weight versus like the psychological rim deterrence? Because I know you can attest to this in watching the Euro game. Very few people are going to attack her because there's so much like psychological factor of looking at a player who is 7'2" right in your way and saying, I'm not doing that. I think it's interesting given that we can observe and we can also quantify so much in terms of our scouting, even back in the day, and translating it to what we can do now. We can do so much with that, but there are still some things that we can't. And I think in this, it's similar to like in baseball when you're trying to like evaluate a catcher. We can now quantify how good their framing is, but we can't quantify their like game management for pitchers, which is still super important. So to me, that's the gray area here we're working with. I'm a little bit lower than Lincoln. I would probably say just a 45, so in a similar place. But that's a 45 given the rules of 1998. Well, really most of the 2000s. I have those concerns. We'll talk about W career in a second, but I think 45 at the time. Hunter, I'm interested in not only what you would give her in 98, but what you'd give her today.
Okay, so when you pair the psychological part of just being 7'2", people don't want to drive into her, pair that with the 3-second rule, that puts her value of what she did then like way more than now. Like what she did then, just it wouldn't work given the rules. So I agree. I would say 45 is probably the safe part there. If she had more coordination and like if she had better defensive instincts and stuff like that and used her size a little bit better, I would say 50. But yeah, just the size in general, 45. I think that's like really good rotation caliber player. And as we found out, she probably exceeded that 45. She was probably closer to a 50 based on what she did in her WNBA career.
Yeah, frankly, even like a minor improvement to her general coordination outside the 3 feet would have given her like a 55 for me. What would you have given her today if you saw this prospect at like Mississippi State?
30. I think 30 is probably what I would give
her. That's exactly where I would have been. Yep.
Just like we see with players like Camille Cardoso's someone that's a big prospect, but I think with Camilla you're getting
more ways than one.
Yeah, I think just you're getting a tall.
I'm calling her tall, to be clear. I just heard that out of my mouth. She's very tall. She has long arms. That's my point.
Yeah, I just think in general, like I don't think you can get higher than 30, given some of the stuff she did. Like she had a couple possessions, Margo that is, where she just couldn't close out at all. Like her closeout instincts were super slow. So I don't think you can really play her more than like 15 minutes on a good night. And based on how the rules were then, even given the defensive rules and her staying in the paint, she was still picking up fouls, like a crazy amount.
During her prime, which was basically her second year in the league to, I want to say basically her 8th or 9th, that's about age 25 to 34, basically, was I think clearly her prime. Even then, she was playing a solid only 24 and a half minutes a game in that span. And back then, it was even less common that you would have sort of the middle of your bench get that many minutes, especially backing up a number one overall pick. One of the things that's interesting to me, her defensive numbers for obvious reason are real standout. Positive residual has the only wins above replacement metric for women's basketball. We occasionally, sometimes somebody will make an RAPM. It's not that common. But for the WNBA, positive residual has a wins above replacement model. And during her prime, her average wins above replacement was about 2 per season, which is good. That's equivalent to back then basically being the 30th best player in the league, 30th to 35th best player in the league on a given season. But the interesting thing is, in only 2 of those years was she basically above replacement level offensively. And some of them she was well below it. But for the most part, you see these pretty big defensive scores. And, that's what you get on that limited basis in the regular season. And so you have to sort of wonder, if you're a GM, you have to ask yourself what the value is you're getting out of that. And I think the biggest thing in comparing her to the player that gets drafted right behind her is essentially how you can build a team with/around that. And to me, I find that the most interesting question.
Number one concern with like transitioning to the modern game would be the mobility, especially defensively, because there's so many 4s and 5s now that are incredibly quick, that are really good with the ball in their hands, putting the ball on the floor. And I just don't think she'd be able to stay in front of hardly any of the starting centers in the league today. And my other concern is the lack of force that she plays with offensively. She's 7'2" and on the block, posting up someone that's like maybe 6'3" and settling for a lot of fadeaways, a lot of
Usually gets pushed back against against players who are even of decent front court strength. Kind of weird.
Which is definitely a concern.
Mm-hmm.
So those would be like my biggest concerns with her game translating to the modern era, and it's definitely a concern then too.
All right, so let's go to a break, and then we're going to finish up with Margo, and then also get into one more player from this time that caught M's eye. All right, so based on what we saw from Margo, let's get into some comparisons. Do you guys have any comparisons from what you've seen from the film to players nowadays on the men's or women's side?
I will let Lincoln go first because I had one and now I can't remember
it. So the obvious comparison on the women's side would be like kind of a slightly more paint-bound version of New York Liberty backup Hanzu, where you have the obvious comparison of being really tall and having a fairly good shooting touch. But the difference is that Margo's a significantly better shot blocker. The men's comparisons that I thought of were kind of like a diet version of Kristaps Porzingis without shooting threes. It's not quite the same kind of player, but there's a couple things that remind me of there's like similarities between their game, mostly having a foot height advantage and being unable to make any progress on a post up. And then the closer in height comparison and statistical impact on the men's side would be George Mirasan, the tallest player in NBA history, who played. Actually, their careers overlapped a little bit. He played in the mid 90s and early 2000s for the Washington Bullets and the New Jersey Nets from 1993 to 2002. 7'7", won a Most Improved Player in 1996, and had the kind of similar around 10 points and 6.5 rebounds per game. So it's like a similar statistical box score impact, but he was the second pick of the third. It was the third pick of the second round instead of the first overall pick out of Romania in 1993. So those are the comparisons that like pop into my head when I was watching Margo play.
Yeah. It is interesting. It is tough, obviously, for obvious reason to find comps. It's interesting that you mentioned George Mirasan, because for me, it was the guy he's tied with the tallest player in NBA history, being Manute Bol. I found I thought a lot more translatability there, given Manute Bol's well documented offensive struggles. I would say, I don't know, probably a little better of a time managing the fouls than either Mirasan or Dydek, but it's interesting in that sense. The one on the women's side that I can best think of is like a reverse Honshu. Like if you completely inverted Honshu's game, I think that's the best way I could describe Margo Dydek.
And like based on this series and all the players we're going to discuss, Margo's one of the lower players on our list. But what made her an interesting discussion was just, it might be the lowest, but it's not every day you see someone that's 7'2", and the uniqueness of her skill set is not talked about very often when you think about some of the best players to enter the league. And the most intriguing players to enter the league is 7'2". Like, I'm not sure how long it'll be until we see another player that's 7'2" enter the league, and because it's been years, we haven't seen anyone since.
That is less than half of not less than half. That's over I believe 4 standard deviations from the mean of height for a woman. So it wouldn't be shocking at all if it took basically another 25 years from today to even basically have like someone who's 7 foot. And again, the funniest thing, we mentioned the -2 wingspan before, but I want to put that in perspective. Brianna Stewart stands at 6'3". She has a longer wingspan than Margo Dydek did, which is wild. She's literally almost a foot shorter. What's also wild, and something you don't see every day, is you don't go to Europe to watch what's going to be the #1 pick play in an early game and then get resoundingly outplayed, which, by someone on the winning team is better. But she gets outplayed by someone who has sort of been lost to the history of women's basketball, at least in the States. And that's Eva Nemkova, I want to talk about for a second. Because Eva Nemkova in this game goes off. Wow. She and one of her teammates tied for a game-high 21 points. And this is not even her best season in the league. Eva Nemkova is someone who had been drafted actually the year before in the Tina Thompson draft, which turned out to overall be not particularly good draft. But even then, for a not particularly good draft, for one in which you have a bunch of players who don't, have the best resumes compared to the draft we're talking about today. The drafts we'll talk about in the future, especially a couple years after this one. This is someone who, at age, I want to say it was age 23, won the European MVP award. She, from basically her age, about her age 19 season, she was putting up 14 points a game in EuroLeague play. From basically turning 21 until when her knees gave out, she averaged about 18.5 to 19 points per game and about 3 assists per game, a steal and a half per game on absolutely ridiculous efficiency. She basically shot 45 from the field, 45 from 3, and 88 from the line across her prime. She was in the W for about 4 seasons. In her first 2 seasons, she was an all-WNBA first-team selection and an all-WNBA second-team selection. She was the best player on a pretty good Cleveland Rockers team that made some noise in the playoffs, even though they had first-round exits. And at this point in time, it is basically impossible to find evidence of her existence. Part of that reason is because basically midway through her fourth season in the W, she suffered the first of what would become a number of severe lower body injuries. It's hard to place exactly where they occurred in terms of the time frame of that, because there's an Achilles tear in there, there's ACL tears multiple in there, there's hamstring issues that eventually forced her retirement. But she has all of those injuries, first of all, that cut short her 4th WNBA season. She comes back for 2 games the year later, which I should mention. She comes back for 2 games the year later alongside to play for Dan Hughes and to play alongside Penny Taylor, the rookie Penny Taylor, a weird confluence of WNBA events going on there. And then after taking some years off, she comes back for basically a couple months in Europe, and she stops playing for. She's no longer playing for a French team. She goes back and she plays for the Czech Republic again. But that's where she's from, and she leads them to she is one of the players that helps lead them to this like miracle European Championship run in 2005. The whole time her hamstring is killing her, and she retires right after that at age that would have basically been 33, 34, I think. And that's it. And again, this player who was an all WNBA selection in each of her first 2 seasons in a really mediocre draft in the WNBA's first year of existence, goes 4th overall. By the next season, she is easily outplaying Margo Dydek, who is going to go 1st overall and then the following draft, on the same court that you have a bunch of scouts who should be watching, who should be going to. It's the WNBA obviously has a lot of international stars and has had a lot of international stars, and with prioritization rules and whatnot, we've been seeing a lot of players get drafted in stashes in recent years, and increasingly there are some of Europe's best players who don't end up coming over to the States. And that's a problem these days, but it wasn't as huge of a problem back then if you, in terms of, bringing them over to play here and having them come over for the few months that they'll be playing for the teams here. And so it is even stranger to me that you have a player like even Mkova, who is such a known quantity in terms of what we can see in her short WNBA career. The difference in scouting from then to now, when you have a player right now like Maya Hirsch, who is quite young, she's still a teenager, but is a first-round pick intended to not come over for another year or two as a young developmental player, comparing that to even Mkova, who won the European MVP in 1996, the year before she entered the draft, and still she only goes fourth. That probably wouldn't happen today, and I think it's one of the things that gets particularly interesting in terms of what we're looking for as professional scouts. Not we, but the community, the industry.
Right, that's a good way to wrap it up. And finally, what would you give her scouting grade? Not just in general, her value grade.
But that's the funny part. Like I said, for 98 in watching Margo, that's a 45 for me. Eva, especially given her age, I think that's an easy 60 to 70. Probably not a 70, but higher than a 60.
Okay. But thanks for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen today. Now join us back for continued WNBA coverage next week. And we'll be talking about Tina Pinachero, one of the greatest passers of all time, Old Dominion star, and eventually played for the Sacramento Monarchs. So join us back next week.
And top player agent these days.
Mm-hmm.